That's it. Okay, so again, I just say thanks to you, especially for giving up this little bit of time for this this project. As a little bit of an introduction about it's a Global Green Grants Fund project where we're trying to develop some kind of action plan for civil society, especially in relation to industrial timber plantations, and especially in relation to the ongoing or the conversions from pines to eucalypts, which are heavier water users. So basically, I'm having a series of interviews with a whole range of peoples from different sectors, mostly, with a kind of a focus on our impact on the planet through resource extraction. And I mean, to me, it's always been interesting to think, about the economics involved, and of course the politics involved in the decisions which drive some of these very destructive forces. So that's why I'm happy that we can talk to you a little bit, and I know that you've also on COVID. I've seen that you've written some nice stuff, and it would be nice to talk a little bit about COVID during our discussions. But yeah, I'd like for you, if you don't mind, to just give a short introduction as to who you are, where you come from, what you're doing, how you've been involved in civil society activism over the past few decades.
Sure, Philip, and thanks for the opportunity to have the conversation, and welcome to those of you who've just tuned in. So my name is, just a bit of background. I was born and raised in Zimbabwe, and grew up there during the Liberation War, during the 1960s and 70s. And then I left to go to university and varsity, and I spent the better part of the 1980s in the United States doing higher education. So I decided to go straight through and do a bachelor's, master's, PhD in 10 years. I just did the whole thing at one go. And my dissertation was on the African National Congress, the ANC. So I came back home to Zimbabwe for a while, and then I
Dale, you've disappeared there for a bit. Maybe you can put your video off if that will speed up the internet.
Yeah. Okay.
Thanks. Just the last.
Yeah, sure. No problem.
Thank you.
So I arrived here in 1991, and for the last 30 years, basically, I've been in South Africa. I got involved very long time ago in the exile liberation movement in the 1980s, and the anti-apartheid, international anti-apartheid movement as well. And that translated into a lot of initial activism here within the ANC and the South African Communist Party in the 1990s. And I won't go into all the details, but I was expelled from the Communist Party in 2000 for basically calling the leadership a bunch of hypocrites, which they are and were, and pretending to be working class heroes, but basically doing exactly the opposite. And my activist trajectory continued with helping co-found the Anti-Privatization Forum in 1999, which was a large social movement dealing with basic services. And then in 2010, also the Right to Know campaign, which is an access to information and freedom of expression national movement, which has been going for the last decade as well. And on the side, I to make a living, I do a lot of research and writing, lecturing occasionally, and have done quite a lot of intellectual work on particular South African political economy, liberation movements, basic services, privatization issues, a range of different kinds of things. So yeah, and I remain very committed to building of mass organizations and a healthy distrust of authority, and calling people to account, and trying to build people's movements that can make our, not only South Africa, but our world a much better place on a whole range of fronts, including obviously the environment and economic and politically as well. So that in a nutshell is a little bit of my background. You're muted. You've muted yourself. I can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Sorry about that. No, I just wanted to say that thank you for that introduction. And to me, before we get into the nitty-gritty of what I'd like to talk to you about, and the work that you've been doing, and the stuff that you write about, just what's always been intriguing about you for me is the way that you use a motorbike for your sole means of transport. And I'd like to talk a little bit about that. Has that always been your main mode of transport, using a motorbike, and the reasons for that?
Sure. Yeah, so I have always, there's a little story behind my love of motorcycles, which is that when I was about 12 years old, I decided that I really wanted to get a little scrambler. You know, we lived in rural Zimbabwe, and my parents basically said, well, good luck with that. Yeah, you know, we're not going to help you at all. And so it was up to me, and make a long story short, I used the better part of a holiday, a US in the United States during the summer to fire, and I eventually made enough money, and I handed it to my father and said, here is enough to buy a motorcycle. And so he couldn't say no. And that was my very first little a bike at 13 years old. Wow. I have always ridden bikes, motorcycles. I've owned 2 cars in my entire life. One was when I was a student, which was a very old car that didn't last for very long. And then when I was running a bookshop in Johannesburg for 5 years, Pambili Books, which was a political bookshop in the early 90s, we had a car. But other than that, I have maintained my love of motorcycles and riding. And I find it not only environmentally and financially much better than cars, but I also find it traveling. So I've gone all across the subcontinent. I've traveled in Namibia, Botswana, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, and all across South Africa on my motorcycle. A little bit of inspiration there from Che Guevara and his motorcycle diaries, traveling across South America when he did that. I just find that when you travel on a motorcycle, you get to meet people, you can go off the main roads, you can take your time, you can see things, and you can also experience the surroundings. You're not in a car which is with air conditioning and music and everything. You're there in the elements, and if it rains, if it hails, I got caught in hailstorms in the Drakensberg. I've got in all sorts of things. So I find it a very real experience and a very exciting one. And I always get a very big, how should we say, lift whenever I ride my bike. So that's the little story on the bike.
Lekker. No, I mean, I also really like motorbikes, but my wife's objection to them is that they are too dangerous for this area, you know. And that's the one thing that I must also say when I see you riding the way that you are, really always professional, and it looks as if you have to be wide awake on your motorbike. But have you had any incidents, accidents with your bike? Because that's the thing.
Yes, I have.
Yeah.
Yes, I did. None of them which were my fault. But, you know, like you say, riding a bike, particularly in a place like Johannesburg, is a risky business. So about 10 years ago, I was taken out and ended up having to have surgery on my right hand. All the tendons were torn off my right thumb and had to be reattached. And also I got a massive cut and gash in my left arm, and I had 18 stitches put into my left arm on that occasion. So that was a little bit of a nasty one. And then about 3 years ago, I was a victim of a hit and run in a very suspect circumstances, a black BMW with blacked out plates and blacked out windows. And it was a very, yes, and tried to take me out. And I fortunately didn't get hospitalized on that one, but my bike was completely destroyed.
Sure. No, of course you have to wear the right clothing and the right jacket and pants and boots. And there's ways to limit or to to mitigate any such incident. But yeah, we're glad that you are still with us, despite many thousands, must be many hundreds of thousands of kilometers on the motorbike. To Mozambique, where did you go in Mozambique? Did you go a little bit up to the north?
I didn't go all the way to Pemba. No, I went up to as far as Gorongosa. And I went, spent quite a bit of time in Beira. I spent quite a lot of time in Vilanculo, also in Xai-Xai, and Maputo.
Did you travel on your own?
I traveled on my own, absolutely. I always travel on my own. I tried to get my girlfriend a few years ago to accompany me, but she refused.
Okay, sure. No, but it does give you a fair amount of freedom, eh? Right, Dale, if we can get back to, or let me just start by just asking you a little bit more about the current work that you are, the International Labor, what is that, research and
Labor Research and Information Group.
What is that about?
Well, ILRIG was formed in 1983 when COSATU was formed. And ILRIG was formed as a service organization to workers and unions, mostly to do with education and research. Over the years, it has transformed itself. It's still predominantly research and education, still predominantly revolves around workers, but not specifically to unions anymore, but to casualized workers, contract workers, and very vulnerable workers in particular. And now we've also have quite a lot of programs with different communities, both rural and urban communities, but we concentrate predominantly on popular education, whether or not that's education with regards to the sector that the workers are there in and learning more about that, or if it's political education in the context of building organization, new forms of organization, and different ways of struggles. So that's what ILRIG does. It's a small outfit. There's only 10 people, 8 in Cape Town and 2 of us here in Johannesburg. But it has a long pedigree of working with workers and poor communities.
How long have you been working with this group?
I've been working with ILRIG for 3 years now. Yeah. Prior to that, for almost 17 years, I was an independent researcher and writer. I worked with many different NGOs and research institutes, but yeah, for ILRIG for 3 years now.
And tell me, this whole COVID pandemic, how has that affected your work with them? Because I suppose not a lot, because I'm sure a lot of it is like, internet-based in a way, research. But how did it affect you and your job?
Well, fortunately for me personally, it hasn't had a huge, massive impact because we are only 2 of us here in Johannesburg. We predominantly work from home anyway. Yeah. So that hasn't been a huge thing. But where it's really impacted on the work of ILRIG is a lot of our work revolves around workshops and meeting with communities and with workers and having education sessions and discussions and forums and these kinds of things. And obviously, because of COVID, that has not been possible for the most part. And I think, as anyone knows in South Africa, when you rely on online communication, it's very unequal. So those particularly who live in smaller towns or rural areas, or where there's even in many townships as well, where the communications are not great and data issues and connectivity. So we found it very, very difficult to hook in with a lot of, just to give you an example, we do a lot of work with farm workers. And it's been almost impossible to have meetings with farm workers because of the connectivity issues and even with data support. So that has made it quite difficult and challenging. We have found new ways of trying to get around that in delivering a lot more publications and having one-on-one meetings and having smaller outfits like this. And so, yeah, but it has really shifted things quite dramatically when you're not able to physically meet a lot, particularly in this case, in the work that we do.
Do you not think it might be, do you know if there are groups, or there are groups, I'm aware of some groups that's promoting the idea of better access for all, better internet access, cheaper data rates, and do you have any involvement with that?
Excuse me. Yes, well, Right to Know campaign was the first organization to come up with those demands about 7 or 8 years ago. We had an entire campaign which was about free data, about making data and the internet a basic service. Basically to say, just like water, just like electricity, we believe that data and access to the internet should be something that should be free and should be publicly available. And so we've lobbied government, we've marched, we've picketed, we've done a whole range of things over the years, and it's obviously been taken up now by some other organizations, some media organizations as well. So yes, this has been a long-running battle to try to get government to, and particularly the public sector, but also to some degree the private sector to pitch in here, which they could easily do, but they refuse to do. To provide the necessary resources. It wouldn't take a lot to make South Africa predominantly, we can see with the cell phone coverage, what the private companies were able to do with cell phones fairly quickly. And almost everybody in South Africa has a cell phone and has cell phone coverage, but internet's another story. So it's a battle that needs to be fought.
Yeah, sorry about that.
It needs to be taken forward.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, for a Zoom meeting like this, I think the guys have been saying that it's more than a gig of data, and it becomes expensive if you live in a rural area. If you don't have a decent job, it's not easy. So it is problematic. So I'm interested to know how. Well, I don't expect that you would have access to this information, but that must be such a, to struggle for free data, for example, should be, 40 million people supporting that kind of idea. Did you have a lot of public support? Because I mean, with hundreds of thousands, millions of people, I can't remember that kind of trending, or am I just too hidden in the bushes here to have known about it?
No, there have been quite a lot of support. I don't know if you've caught, about 2 or 3 years ago. About 2 or 3 years ago, there was one of some DJs and some personalities began to take up the campaign. I think it was DJ Thibaut Touch. I think was also one of those, and it became quite. There was an uptick in the support for the campaign, but yeah. It has been quite challenging and somewhat frustrating because when it's very supported. I don't think there's anyone out there, particularly from working class communities and who would not support this campaign.
Exactly.
But to get, government and the ANC in particular, and its Department of Communications specifically, to actually, carry through. They've been making all sorts of promises. They have papers. They have discussions. They say, yes, we're going to do it. We're going to roll out this. We're going to do all of it. And it just becomes like everything else in our country, which is it's riven with factionalism. It's riven with corruption. It's mismanagement. A large portion of the budget that was supposed to go, for example, to the rollout has disappeared into the pockets of who knows whom. So it's suffering from exactly the same kind of problems that I think have affected a lot of other struggles for basic needs and services.
Because yeah, it should be a basic need, because education, obviously it can assist tremendously in that regard. So do you think that it's a struggle that's going to be won in the end? Are people going to have access to cheap data or even free data? I saw an interest somewhere on some of these internet ads or something, where they just ask people, what do you want? Or what would you prefer? Good, fast internet or running water? And I mean, it's just amazing to see how many people are making the choice and saying, no, they'd rather have free or fast internet than running water. So it just goes to show how important, that communication link has become. And, it's a business link, it's a communication link, it's such a powerful tool that it needs to be available, because it can.
Yeah, listen, I mean, Philip, I think it will be eventually. I think it's inevitable, precisely because the entire world is moving in that direction. And I think sooner or later, just like a lot of things, the cost will come down. The impetus for the rollout will be much greater than than it is now, precisely because not to be connected will basically leave people out, which it's already doing. But we did a study with Right to Know a few years ago in the Eastern Cape, where we did surveys, and we asked people questions about, what kind of choice they have to make over their household budget. And many of them were saying they had to buy, it's not just about data times to talk to your friends or to have Zoom, to attend Zoom meetings. It was data time to call the doctor, to call the ambulance, to get in touch with the local, to go get in touch with the local principal or the school, to call. So these are all, communication and data time is essential to everything, particularly when you don't, and the only thing you have is a cell phone possibly. So there is a real impetus there for it to be, part of a basic service package. That'll eventually become the case, where people won't have to make the decisions, as they told us in the Eastern Cape, between whether or not they buy food or they buy data.
Exactly. Yeah. Can you tell me a little bit more, or us a little bit more, about this Right to Know campaign? How it started out? What was your involvement, and how's that organization's growing?
Sure. So I think some people would probably know that back in about 2009, 2010, at that time the new Zuma crew that had taken over government introduced a bill called the Protection of State Information Bill, which we dubbed the Secrecy Bill, basically, which became popularly known as eventually. And that bill, basically, if one looked at it right from the beginning, it would have given unfettered powers to the state security agency and the spooks and the spies, as well as the government, to essentially snoop on people, surveil people, but not just that, but also to basically make all government information confidential, essentially make it incredibly difficult for any public citizen to access any information that they needed for the realization of their rights. Would have made it virtually impossible for us to struggle for a whole range of things and to request information and to get it in order to take those forward. So we opposed this, and eventually a few activists got together. This very quickly grew into a very public campaign that led to the formation of the Right to Know campaign. And then it quickly expanded beyond the secrecy bill to a campaign that would encompass right to freedom of expression, defense of the media, a free media, and particularly a free and independent media, and a well-resourced media as well. And also the right to gather and protest. So it's not just your freedom of expression in terms of saying or writing what you want, but also we found that, what was happening in those days was communities and others were getting repressed constantly when they came out to gather in the streets. And one of the reasons why they gathered in the streets and protested was because most communities don't have information. They don't know what's going on. They don't know how the budgets are being spent. They don't know how anything is being done because the politicians want to make it all secret. And so the Right to Know campaign addressed a lot of these things, it grew and has grown. Well, it grew into a fairly sizable national organization with presence in at least 4 to 5 provinces, and has been very effective, I think, over the years in not only keeping those issues in the public domain and in the mind, but we've won quite a lot of battles and pushed back that secrecy agenda. The Protection of State Information Bill was never signed into law. Well, it was signed into law, but it's never been basically made the law. It's still sitting with Cyril Ramaphosa right now, 10 years after it passed. And on a range of other fronts, some of the battles have not been won, but they continue to be fought. But right now, the Right to Know campaign is going through a tough time, like many other movements and organizations, where you have a situation, I think, where there's a lot of contestation, some factionalism. I call it ANC politics that is sort of affecting a lot of different movements in civil society. There's a range of different things I think that would be important for any civil society activist and any South African to talk about how we build our movements, how we run them democratically and make them accountable, but how when we build those kinds of movements like a Right to Know, it invites a lot of opportunists, it invites a lot of people who want to take advantage of the situation, and it invites a lot of people who want to divide it. So I don't know how many people saw the Zondo Commission testimony of Jeff Hadebe in about few weeks ago, where he was reporting on the study that had been done, that they had done, the independent study they had done into the state security, and they had found documents where the state security had planted spies within the Right to Know campaign.
Sure.
And they boast about it and successfully monitoring the Right to Know, dividing it. And so we have to be aware of these things, and those are challenges as well.
Yeah. I just want to ask if people can just check that they are muted, because there seems to be some feedback that's recently started. So if everybody can just check that they are muted, except you, of course, Dale. Yeah, it seems to be gone. But Dale, you can still hear me and talk, hey? Dale, you're there still?
Yes,
there?
I can hear you.
Okay, cool.
Yes. Yeah.
And yeah, can I also just ask you to briefly talk about the anti-privatization forum? But before you go, I also just want to ask anybody else, because there's not too many. I think there's 5 other participants. So if anybody wants to ask a question for Dale, if there's something that he says that you find you want to respond to, anyone is more than welcome, being a small group. So just unmute yourself and go with it. Yes, Dale, if you can just anti-privatization forum. How did you get involved, and what's it about? And maybe, I'm sorry, but before you get to that, I want to know what you think made the Right to Know campaign, what made it successful, whilst it was successful. What was there a central driver? Was the issue big enough so that the whole range of organizations could tackle it? What do you think?
Okay. Yeah. So let me just start with that second question, because we were talking about the Right to Know campaign.
Yeah.
And I would just say this, that what made it, and this is one lesson that I've learned from 40 years now of being an activist, which is that you have to have, it doesn't matter whether you're a small organization or whether you're a large movement, you have to have committed, honest, and principled activists. This is at the core of any movement. And if you don't have principled, honest, and committed activists, well, you can start an organization, you can do certain things, but you're eventually going to basically fail. You're going to fold, precisely because you cannot sustain that kind of organization if you, and in the Right to Know, we had a really good core of incredibly committed people. The vast majority of people who are in the Right to Know did not make a cent. They never got paid. They never were there. They were activists. They were doing it because they thought this was the right thing to do. And that is rare these days.
Yeah.
That's one of the problems is that we have a situation and where oftentimes people join organizations and movements because they want to get something out of it. That's not about because I think it's the right thing to do or because we really want to fight a particular battle. And the Right to Know campaign was very successful in the other reason why was because it reached out beyond its own immediate constituency. So, for example, you know, a lot of organizations that work with, for example, communities and workers, they say, well, we can only work with workers and poor people. That's it. We cannot work with the middle class. We can't work with government. We can't work with any of these other organizations because it's only, and oftentimes what that does is you can be quite effective in doing that, but you only can go so far. You can't get a lot of currency within the rest of society unless you reach out to other people who are not in your circles and who are not agreeing with you, and engage with them, debate with them, argue with them, and Right to Know did that. So it got quite a lot of support. And I think also the issues that were there, that the Right to Know campaign was taking up, spoke to a lot of people in terms of what was happening in South Africa. So when you talk about right to freedom of expression, and you have a government and you have a president that's basically trying to smash anybody who disagrees with him, well, then people get upset. And they'll say, yes, I want to support a struggle where I'm defending my right to say something or my right to basically go out in the streets and protest. I believe these things are fundamentally important. So it appeals across class, oftentimes. It also appeals across political divides sometimes, or ideological divides. And I think the Right to Know was successful in doing that. And it's a rarity in South Africa, because one of the biggest problems in South Africa with civil society is civil society organizations become very, very contained within their own little circles, and they speak to themselves and they speak to those people they know. And you might be able to do certain things, but you're only able to go not very far. No. Because the whole point of building a movement, to me, is to get mass support and to reach across lines. We are a very divided society. We are a very, very fractured society. Yeah. And I think it's incumbent upon us to do that. The No campaign did that to a certain extent. To move on to the APF, which was a different animal completely in terms of organization. The APF was one of those organizations that explicitly said, we are forming ourselves because we are fundamentally against the privatization of things, particularly basic needs and basic services. So in the late 1990s, when government started to, for example, privatize water supplies, was one of the key ones was in Mbombela there in Nelspruit, you know, with the Bywater, and that was one of the first privatization water struggles that we were involved, that led to the formation of the APF. Privatizing, for example, municipal services, housing, transport, education, all sorts of basic needs and services were getting sort of sold off and privatized, and that made them inaccessible and unaffordable. So what happened was...
Sorry, that's a kind of a global trend, isn't it? This privatization of
yes, well, the privatization was part of a much larger economic package that we called sort of neoliberalism. Well, you know, a particular variant of capitalism, which basically said, you know, came out of the 1980s, Margaret Thatcher in the UK and Ronald Reagan in the United States, and which basically said the state and the public sector must sell off everything to the private sector. The private sector can run everything and more efficiently and better and deliver these services. The problem, of course, fundamentally is that not only is that completely factually wrong, but also it leads to a situation where if your purpose is to make profit and money, well, you're not interested in those that can't pay.
Exactly.
So if it's a poor community, well, it's too bad. Then you're not going to deliver water to a poor community because the poor community can't pay for that water. You're not going to deliver electricity because there's no market there. So when you adopt that kind of mentality, privatization mentality, what you do is you fundamentally say the ability to live in this world, the ability to enjoy the basics is dependent upon whether or not you can pay for it. And if you can't pay for it, well, too bad. You're going to die. You're not going to be able to get water. You're not going to be able to get electricity. And this is fundamentally wrong. And so we many activists, workers, students, community organizations. We all came together. The APF was a really impressive collection of different organizations cutting across sectors that said, you know, whether they were privatizing education, or you're privatizing municipal services, or basic water, electricity, and other things, people came together and we formed this organization. And it was explicitly designed to struggle against that and for basic needs and for the public provision of basic needs on the basis that water is, these are rights. These are fundamental, universal human rights. They are not privileges. We don't enjoy, we can't live in a world, and we can't live in a country where you're told that if you did not get a proper education and therefore you cannot get a proper job, well, too bad. We're going to cast you aside, and we're not going to deal with you. We're not going to give you any of these basic services because you can't participate in the capitalist market because you have no money. And that's the fundamental problem. And the APF spoke to that, and it mobilized and became, over many years, a very powerful social movement, predominantly based in Gauteng, but spreading its wings out into many other provinces. And I think it was a hugely, hugely influential movement on a range of fronts that tried its best, and I think was quite successful in holding back that onslaught of privatization, even though obviously that it wasn't always successful.
Oh. No, thanks, Dale. I want to just talk a little bit about some of the stuff that I've read that you've written in the last year or so, especially in relation to COVID. I was interested in these. I think there was 4 countries that you mentioned, which the COVID numbers are remarkably low. And it's interesting to look at the commonalities amongst those countries. One was Mauritius, I think. The other one was Vietnam, Cuba, and which was the last one?
It was Taiwan.
Exactly. So, and it seemed as if the main thing that all of them had in common was a functional health system, which is public and available to all. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Sure, Philip. And I think it's important to note this because, since COVID hit, remember in the first year, we were when people were looking at other countries that were having some success, most of the ones that were celebrated were countries like New Zealand, initially Germany, and a few maybe Scandinavian countries and everything. But nobody was talking about Mauritius, as we mentioned, Cuba, Vietnam, Taiwan to a certain extent. And so what I wanted to find out was, well, why? What is it about these countries? What did they do? Or did they do something that somebody else did or didn't do? Or did they have things? And one of the things, as you mentioned, that just was absolutely, there's 2 things that were absolutely crucial. One was a very well-resourced, accessible, affordable, and free public healthcare system. This is the main lesson of this pandemic, is that countries that do not have, there's no better poster child than the United States. The United States basically destroyed its public healthcare system over the last 30 years, and they're paying the consequences. 500,000 people have died as a result of this because, and it mostly hurts, obviously, people of color, people who are poor.
Can I just stop you there? And just, something that I found interesting, Dale, is like, okay, how many people in the US have died from COVID? I think it's 500.
500,000. Yes, 500,000 now. Over 500
people. Sure, that's tragic, and that's a lot of people. But I also, when you look at America's got a population of about 400 million. Is that more or less?
Yeah, not quite, but yeah.
So if the average lifespan is, say, 70 years, the amount of people that's going to die each year is, in the millions. I think it's around 5 million people that's going to be dying just from old age. So in the past year, half a million people have died from COVID. but I suppose that not all of them, but many of them were old people. Not that I'm trying to minimize the effect of it, but isn't it a little bit overblown? Is there for those 500,000 people that have died in the US? Surely some of them might have died this year in any case, or don't you think that argument or that kind of way of thinking is healthy?
No, I would actually argue the exact opposite, Philip. I would say that it's not overblown, it's underestimated. So basically, if you looked at what happened in the United States and other countries, we call it excess deaths. The deaths that you can't sort of say maybe they were COVID, maybe they were from other things. In our country, tuberculosis, diabetes, high blood pressure, all the other major causes of death, heart disease, cancer, these kinds of things. The bottom line is that if there's anything, there's been an undercount, because in order to be able to count all of the people that have possibly died, you would have to have huge tracking and tracing, which many countries, and including the United States, didn't even have for the first several months. Yeah. And the statistics, so for example, there's many countries in Africa, including a country like Tanzania, which refuse to even say that COVID exists. So you have no idea what the numbers are. You're just a guess. It's a guess. And I think that those who are approaching this pandemic, and this is just the first, possibly of many to come, of different ones. And we can get into why that's going to be the case because of human destruction of nature and a whole range of other reasons why these pathogens are being released. And we're getting new viruses of increasing virility, and this kind of virus, these things are going to happen precisely because of human behavior more than anything else. So we better learn the lessons, and we better learn them fast. And if there's any lessons to be learned from these countries, it's that, I'll get back to it, a good public healthcare system. And second, the other part of it was strong community organization. So local organizations that are able very quickly to identify cases, to basically help people, to make sure that you track and trace, to have all sorts, as opposed to it being a central commanded state-led solution where it's up from the top. People think as Cuba, this communist country, which is, the state is all powerful. But one of the amazing things about the Cuban health system is that there's one doctor for every about 40 or 50 people in the entire country. And they have local clinics. They have everybody can go and access things very quickly.
But I mean, that sounds like a impossibility for the rest of the world, especially Africa. One doctor for every 50 people.
No, it's not an impossibility. In fact, Philip, it's something that if, again, this is the problem with the way I think our political and economic discourse is that we tend to approach things and say, it's not impossible, for example, to send somebody to Mars and to potentially colonize Mars and to have space exploration, but it's impossible to provide basic healthcare services for a human population. Absolutely, it's absolutely possible. It's a question of political will, and it's a question of using the public resources in the right way. So, for example, we have a country north of us, the DRC, which is one of the richest countries in the world in terms of natural resource, everything, but it's one of the poorest in terms of basic services. Why is that the case? Not because it's not possible to have a proper healthcare system in the DRC but is because you have people who are simply greedy, who are selfish, who want to take advantage of things, who want to wage war in order to be able to make huge amounts of money, and who do these. And this is why we are activists. We are activists precisely because we look at the world and we don't like it, and we say we want to change it. And we believe that we can change it. Because if we don't believe that we can change it, then there's no point as far as I'm concerned. Yeah. Then you're just sort of saying, well, we're playing games here. That doesn't mean you're naive and that you have this sort of like idealist, well, yes, it's a struggle, but it's all very possible. And what this pandemic has shown us is that our priorities are upside down as a world, as a country. Instead of South Africa is an incredibly wealthy country, absolutely incredibly wealthy. We have what their problem is that we have 5% of our population that owns 80% of the wealth. And they're hoarding it, and they're taking it overseas, and they're doing all sorts of other things with it while they're paying workers very low wages, and they're raping the environment, and they're doing all sorts of other things. We can stop this. We can change this around, but it's going to take a lot of people to do it. And that's why we're activists, and we don't give up, irrespective of how difficult it is. So to me, what this pandemic has done is and it's just the beginning, is it should have shown us where the real fault lines in society are. We now have the real opportunity as a society and as a global, both to begin to put things right. Because if we don't do it, it's not going to matter. These debates and these discussions will not matter, because climate-wise, as you well know, and many environmentalists know, we're heading in the wrong direction. If we don't shift this in another 50 to 70 years, this world is going to be virtually uninhabitable. So that's the challenge that we have. And so we really don't have much of a choice. We either change it or we die.
Yeah, no, I agree. And sorry, but previously I just, there has to be some balance. And to me, just 50 or one doctor for every 50 people just sounds like a little bit of, too many doctors. Personally, I don't like doctors that much. I don't like going to them. I want to talk a little bit about these rogue leaders that you mentioned in one of your Daily Maverick articles, and I want to ask if you can explain what the bony-eared assfish is.
So when I was writing that piece, I was looking for examples of where the stupidest, most horrible things and worst things that people have done around the world during that first part of the pandemic. And of course, one didn't have to look much further than Donald Trump in the United States, because, there's so many things about him and his politics and his way of doing things that is. And so I was trying to look and as opposed to just sort of making a critique, as usual, of all the different things. And I found this reference when I was reading something else to a very small, it's almost a microscopic little fish. It's almost like a tadpole in the sea. It's only found, I think, in the North Atlantic somewhere. Mm-hmm. And it's called a bony-eared assfish. And that is the real name. That is the actual biological name of this thing. And I thought it fit very, very well, because if you Google or read up on this bony-eared assfish, you'll see that it's basically got no backbone whatsoever. It's gelatinous. It's a very sort of, it's like Trump, essentially. No brain, of someone who can be manipulated left, right, and center, only thinks of himself. And so I said Trump is a bony-eared assfish, and I used that as an opening to sort of have a satirical look at some of these what I call rogue leaders and rogue elements and what they had done. And of course, Trump was at the center of that in terms of his absolute outrageous behavior at the beginning when this hit, as well as some of the other, like Putin and Xi of China, even though that he got a very good sort of coverage. The other kinds of things that happened in China with regards to how dissidents were dealt with, and people who wanted to expose the initial part of the virus, including the very first doctor, was victimized and imprisoned, and other kinds of things. So I just looked at examples of how those people who have political and economic power, when something like this hits, how they act, and oftentimes how they act for themselves as opposed to the interests of their citizenry and their population.
Yeah. Just before we move on from that topic about the 4 countries that did reasonably well, you said the first thing that they had in common was good healthcare. The second thing was the ability to organize, and then there was is there something else?
I said it wasn't just the ability to organize; it was good local community organization. Right. In other words, very local. Things that we used to have in South Africa quite some time ago, where if someone in the community, if something happened, if there was people knew very quickly, they were able to act very quickly. There was a collective, there was an organization there. And door to, street committees, these kinds of things. That's what exists in many of these countries, where they were able very quickly, when there was a positive case or there was somebody who was sick and everything, to respond to that, as opposed to having to wait for central government to deal with the matter.
Wow. And tell me, Dale, you're going to take that inoculation, that vaccination?
Absolutely, and I encourage every single person to do so. You know, to me, I remember I have a story here in terms of my own personal, you know, dealing with vaccines. When I was a child in rural Zimbabwe, I remember when I traveled for the first time, and I think I was about 4 years old, and my parents told me that was back in the early 1960s. And they said, in order for you to travel, you're going to have to get about 4 different vaccinations, because you won't be able to travel unless you have a cholera, unless you have a yellow fever, unless you have a polio vaccine, unless you have this and that and everything else. I said, oh, wow, as a little kid. So I got all these shots. I didn't like them very much. But over the years, I found out, and I did research in terms of how, for example, polio was basically eradicated as a result of shot increasingly, particularly in developing countries, how rubella, how a whole range of different things in terms of vaccinations were very effective. And particularly what was hugely impressive to me was Jonas Salk, who was the founder, who came up with the polio vaccine. And when he was asked, and I wrote about this recently, when he was asked, well, who owns the vaccine? Who owns the rights? Who owns them? And he says, the people do. And of course, that doesn't exist anymore now, because big pharmaceuticals are making huge amounts of money over these things and want to make it into something. So I'm a huge supporter of properly scientifically based peer, you know, everything has to be done properly, and it has to be safe, and it has to be done looked over by the public sector. And once that happens, vaccines have proven to be very, very effective in containing a whole range of different viruses and diseases. So yes.
No, but you know, at the moment, because the understanding of the argument that people are making say that this vaccine was just developed so quickly, you know, and these things, they need to be tested thoroughly, and it needs to be. And I mean, then other things like the first vaccine that was brought out here in South Africa, which apparently it doesn't work for this new strain, you know. And the other thing is that some people are still, I mean, I'm not, my wife had it, although she tested negative for it twice, but she did have the antibodies, which I didn't have, and I spent quite a lot of time with her. So I mean, just the way that it spreads, and the way that it's transmitted, or in my case not transmitted, I have no antibodies. You know, you sometimes distrust you know, what you hear in the media, because it's different from what you experience as a person. But well, yeah.
I was going to say, there's a lot of misinformation. You know, we just had a webinar the other day with the 3 incredible health workers and frontline health workers, doctors, epidemiologists, others, who will be the first to tell you that there is never 100% guarantee of anything. There never has been, there never will be. And anybody who tells you is lying. But what they're also telling you is that the work that has been done over the last year and a half has taken what would normally take 5 years, and they put it in because there's been such a huge commitment to try to find something here. And people have been working 80-hour, 90-hour weeks for the last year in order to be able to try to break through and find these things. It's a work in progress. We learn as we go. Human beings took decades to eradicate some diseases. This is not going to happen in a year. This is not going to happen in 2 years. It's not going to happen in 3 years. This is going to be and I think the one thing that I've learned in the last year is people have this feeling that, you know, oh, wow, if we only, you know, if we do one, then it's going to deal with it. We'll be able to get back to normal. If we do this, no, this is not going to happen. This is going to be with us for a long time. We're going to go through different waves. There's going to be new vaccines. There's going to be new variants. No. And the doctors and the health workers will tell you.
The only folks that's really going to be happy is the guys that produce these vaccines, you know, the pharmaceutical industry.
Well, not if governments have the political backbone to do what they did, for example, with the HIV/AIDS, which was, and this is one thing that we talked about, which is this intellectual property rights, which the big pharmaceuticals are using in order to basically take the know-how and everything else and keep it for themselves, so that people can't create generic vaccines, which are much, much cheaper and much, much more readily available. So this should be one of the key things that people start struggling for, just like in the HIV/AIDS, which we did, where big pharmaceuticals wanted to charge outrageous amounts of money for antiretrovirals, but they're eventually defeated and eventually forced to do this. And this should be the case with COVID-19, everything.
Yeah, no, I'm sure it will be 10 years or 5 years or hopefully 2 years down the line. But at the moment, I mean, these oaks are just whistling all the way to the bank, you know. They're making a shitload full of money of a fear that's been induced into the peoples, you know, and a fear which, I mean, yeah, personally, I know of one person that, you know, that's close to me that's had it, and she, it was like a bad flu, you know.
Well, Philip, I just have to say this. I think it's very, very important that we do not underestimate. I've had 3 family members who have been hospitalized. I've counted now 20 comrades who've died of COVID in Johannesburg. I just got through on the phone earlier today with someone who's in their 15th day in hospital on an oxygen machine. This is very real. It's all across the board. It's everything. And it's not about fear. There's nothing about, what we need to do is we need to look this thing in the face directly, just like we would look anything in the face directly, just like HIV/AIDS, just like every other kind of thing, and begin to deal with it so that we don't have to have a situation where we're actually having debates about whether or not there is COVID or whether or not COVID is this. These are nonsense.
I mean, apart from these kinds of debates globally and locally, the train is going full speed, you know, loaded with injections. So it's not as if any debate anywhere about this, the fact that everybody is being standing in a queue to be vaccinated. The fact that there's debate about that, it doesn't seem to be slowing down the train in any shape or form, you know. So, but it's still good that they, I mean.
What do you mean by that? Slow that, Philip.
Sorry? What do I mean by?
I don't understand your point.
No, my point is that apart from if debate about you know, any debate about this disease and the efficacy of the vaccinations, it's not slowing down a global and it shouldn't slow down the global process, as you rightfully say. But I think globally and even locally, vaccinations is being rolled out as quickly as possible, as quickly as the infrastructure can handle it. And there's no debate about, you know, the efficacy of the that's going to slow that process, you know. So I don't think that is it is a concern, but there should be debate about it, obviously, and there has been debate about it, and of course, you know, to me, sure, when I heard about it, or when it got serious in around February, March last year, I got a strong sense that I should, you know, be careful, and I felt like using this Artemisia afra, you know, Villa Ols or Muhlonyani, a locally growing herb that's a very well-known you know, dewormer, and it's really good for your chest and good for a whole range of things. But I felt that I wanted to use it, and I used it. You know, you mustn't use too much because it's medicine. But I brewed a couple of times. I brewed a tea and I had it, and I felt that it protected me. You know, so I think that, you know, there should be. I think there's definitely local herbs and things that can also help. You know, and I think that traditional health practitioners and their insights should not be dismissed, in just outright dismissed in favor of Johnson and Johnson, you know.
Well, first, sorry, Philip, I've got to say, first of all, I was not making that argument. I certainly didn't make that, but we have to, there's basically, let me go back to the HIV/AIDS thing if we want to have this debate. There was nobody that was saying that, for example, and I know, and everybody else knows, that there are certain things that are healthy for you, that are antioxidants, that are good, and you can take them and herbal, fine, no problem. People should do it. They should supplement these things and do those things. But I can tell you from knowing and working for years and years and years with many people who had HIV and AIDS, the reason why their lives were saved was because they had access to antiretrovirals. Yeah. That's why they're still alive 20 years later. Yeah. So we just need to get the bottom line is this. It's nobody is saying that you can't look and try to make other things that are going to make you feel healthier and make you feel better and everything else. But I believe in science. I believe that when science tells us that, you know, that this is going to, and they've proven that's the case, they've showed it, they've done the trials, it's everything, nobody's making it up, it's not some conspiracy theory, there's no issue, this is what there's efficacy of these things, then that's where I will be the first in line to make sure that those, because I will take my tea and I will take my other kinds of things, but I'll also take the vaccination because I want to make sure that I live. Yeah.
No, and travel, I mean, because you won't be able to go to Mozambique one of these days if you haven't had your injection. No, I mean, in a way, but yeah, all of us have had our vaccinations when we were young, and it's true. I mean, I once had a terrible hay fever, terrible hay fever. Couldn't stop fucking sneezing at times. I couldn't get close to a stable, you know, when it was just that fine dust. Even maize meal made me sneeze. And then I went for a series of injections. Man, I think it was like 2 weeks or something. I went for an injection every couple of days. And I've never had hay fever again, you know. But later on, they took that off the market, said it's too dangerous. I don't know what the long-term impact on me personally could be. Maybe there is some harmful agent in there. Well, the point is, I'm not sneezing anymore, and
Well, I tell you what, Philip, I'm more concerned about the fact that I live in Johannesburg and I breathe in the air in Johannesburg than I am about any vaccine side effects. No. We're living in a toxic world. We're living in a world that there's so many different people are dying of a whole range of different things all the time that we can prevent. And if my point is, as an activist, it should be trying to do, whether that's in the form of a vaccine or whether that's in the form of a clean environment or whether that's in the form of healthy food or whatever the case might be.
Yeah. I want to just get back to something that you mentioned earlier about COVID, and that's the last thing that we'll talk about, COVID. But you know, the fact that there's environmental degradation, that there's these massive industrial monocultures, the way that we've been destroying environmental resilience and biodiversity, all of this plays a role and is a driver for these diseases to become more and more, you know, frequent.
Absolutely. One of the first things I tried to do research on and wrote about when this pandemic hit us was its origins. And obviously what I found, whether or not one wants to contest or debate about the origins of this particular coronavirus, COVID-19, coming from that animal market in China, and as a result of people eating wild animals and then it passing, those pathogens passing, whether or not you want to debate the larger point is that as a result of human beings destroying ecosystems, forests, rainforests in particular, where wild animals have lived for millennia, and not in touch with human beings, and all of a sudden they're getting encroached upon, they're having contact with human beings are killing them, they're eating them, they're doing all these things. All of these things are releasing all of these pathogens that have been kept in the soil and those animals for millennia. And it's no surprise that it's human beings' destructive behavior that releases these kinds of things. And it's the same, you know, whether or not it's going to be another coronavirus after this one, or whether or not, for example, it's cholera, let's say, which has killed hundreds of thousands of people on the African continent. Why is there cholera? Because it's dirty water, because there's no clean water to drink. And so if human beings are destroying the groundwater and polluting it and making it very difficult for people to get access to water. So whether it's that, whether it's a virus, whatever it is, excuse me, the causes oftentimes are reducible to human behavior in extracting and trying to basically, clear cut forests, for whether that's for new mines, whether that's for growing sorghum, or whether that's for growing, whatever it is, for feed, for cattle feed or cattle farming, or whatever it is in the Amazon, anywhere else, palm oil in the Indonesia and in the Far East. It's all the same. It has the same kinds of consequences. So yes, it's fundamentally, we have to stop this kind of behavior if we're going to stop these kinds of things happening. If we continue this, the coronavirus is going to be child's play compared to the next virus that comes along.
Probably, yes. But I mean, it does present a bit of a dilemma, because I mean, we're all complicit in the way that we, that we live, and the way that the system that we are in, and the fact that we drive a car and that we use fossil fuel. And I mean, you can try and use less of that, but it's difficult to get completely away from that. And I mean, like for instance, in our area where there's these massive industrial timber plantations, used to primarily produce paper and pulp products, but now, of course, as the global demand have changed, and there's a bigger demand for cellulose, producing cellulose here at Sapinowodwana, and that's become the #1 line. And now pine plantations are being converted to eucalyptus plantations, which of course use heavier water users with more of an industrial impact. So yeah, the way that we treat our environment and degrade the natural ecosystem services, which would contain these viruses and things. The more diversity is really, in my view, the key to the spice of life. We need diversity, and that is why monoculture is just an incredible problem. We don't have that much time left, Dale, and I want you just to reflect a little bit about your environment in Johannesburg, where you stay. You alluded to it a little bit earlier when you talked about the air that you breathe. What, in your view, would be some of the major environmental impacts that people in your area are faced with?
Well, air quality is probably one of the most major. I don't know if anybody does this on a regular basis, but I have started to pay attention to it over the last 2 or 3 years. I look at air quality indexes, and Joburg is always amongst the worst in the world in terms of major cities. On the index that oftentimes is used from 1 to 5, 1 being very, very good, clean air, and 5 being the worst, Joburg is oftentimes either a 4 or a 5.
Sure.
So I think we live in a toxic city, and that's not surprising given the fact that it was built upon mines and mine dumps. And mine dumps are everywhere, all across Johannesburg and its surrounding areas. And when the wind blows, and everybody knows this, and all of the different toxic materials that then get into the air and we breathe in. And those that live close to it, like people in Snake Park in Soweto, where the rates of cancer and asthma and deformities amongst children are through the roof. Sure. As a result of the toxicity of the mine dumps that they are living on, and literally living on. So I think that's a crucial issue here for people that are living in Johannesburg in particular. But there's also, in terms of environmentally, the water situation for many people is not good at all. It's still okay in the suburbs and in some of the main townships, but if you live in an informal settlement, if you live in the downtown areas of some of the CBD or Hillbrow or other place, and this is the richest city in not only in South Africa but in the continent, and yet at the heart of the city, people are drinking contaminated water.
Oh,
And water that is unhealthy precisely because the infrastructure is going, to pot, essentially. The average age of the pipes in Johannesburg is 60 years old,
sure.
and they're breaking down. So this provides quality of water then becomes a huge, huge issue. And it's becoming much more so of an issue. And then, of course, there's all sorts of other pollutions. There's noise pollution. There is, your general sort of kind of, the transport and the things that one has to deal with on a regular basis in terms of, for example, refuse collection. I don't know the last time that anyone on this on here has come down and walked through the Johannesburg CBD, and particularly the west part of the CBD, but it's become a rubbish dump.
Sure.
And they're not doing the basics anymore. And so, this is also part of the problem. And then acid mine drainage, which I think people know quite a bit about because of some of the stories that have been done, is a huge sort of longer term threat. They've managed, I think, to somewhat contain it in the last 2 or 3 years, but it's a temporary fix. We're living in Joburg on a catacomb of mines. And water is collecting, toxic water is collecting underneath and coming to the surface, particularly when the water table gets saturated as a result of all the rains. So and then your water table gets poisoned, and then there's a whole range of issues, but those are the main ones I can think of.
And tell me, Dale, what if you don't have to talk in depth about this, but can you mention a couple of examples of the communities and or some of the ways in which people tackle these problems as a community or as individuals, or
Sure.
what are people doing to try and clean the air and to clean the water and to live in an unpolluted city?
Yeah, so I mean, I want to give you the example of a really excellent group of community organizations that have come together in a movement called VEJA, which is the Vaal Environmental Justice Alliance. And of course, as everybody knows about the Vaal, which is in the south of in the Joburg area, and going all the way down to Sasolburg and those areas, it's a very heavy industry area, highly polluted and everything else. And what they've been doing is they've been trying to hold people accountable. And in this case, many of those that are responsible for the air pollution and the water pollution are the big industrial emitters and the big industrial corporations, with the connivance of the public sector and public officials and Department of Environment, which are not enforcing the regulations and are not holding them accountable. So they have engaged in a whole range of different kinds of struggles. Everything from testing their water and their air samples and providing the scientific evidence to show the levels of pollution so that people can't argue that this is not the case, to going out into the streets, to pressurizing government to start taking this seriously and enforce the regulations, to pressuring things like ArcelorMittal, formerly ISCOR, to basically clean up areas themselves, which they've polluted. If you go and visit parts of the Vaal, there are standing tar pools all over the place. It's incredible. It's not just a question of open sewage anymore. It's tar pool. It's just toxic sludge that has been pumped into, and the Vaal River and the Vaal Dam are highly polluted as a result of this, as also in the failure of basic infrastructure. So VEJ has been doing an amazing work, oftentimes unheard and unseen and underappreciated, but holding back what could be a much worse situation. And then you have outfits, for example, like in the inner city forum, and other community residential, in some of those flat complexes, which hold thousands and thousands of people who have been fighting not only against their own evictions, but also to try to make sure that the infrastructure gets properly fixed so that they can have clean, accessible water, and to try to hold people accountable who are basically doing this pollution and doing these kinds, and particularly both government and the private sector. So there are attempts, there are struggles constantly going on. And oftentimes we don't hear about these things because they're not really, high profile, or they don't catch the news media, but they are happening And there are many, many amazing activists and people on the ground who are trying their best to not just deal and answer these things, but to basically try to turn those tables, and are fighting obviously an uphill battle in doing so.
Yeah. I think last week when we had a similar interview with Brian Ash, he also mentioned the importance of, building coalitions, getting people together to act together around issues. And of course, then you do become a lot stronger. And then from an international perspective, because I mean, many problems are local, but many of the drivers are international. Which coalitions do you support, or can you tell us a little bit about that's doing work on a global level?
Well, it depends on what sort of arena, I guess, you're focusing on and everything else. But I think that there's some really good work that is being done, for example, with outfits like Friends of the Earth, who are trying to pull together some environmental organizations across the globe around those kinds of things. Some of the students that started and were inspired by Greta Thunberg and looking at sort of the youth and trying to get them involved. I think those international coalitions and under various different names are quite important in that context. There are research and intellectual institutions like the Transnational Institute out of Europe that does incredible research around basic services. The Public Services International, which is a collection of all sorts of unions across the world, has done some really good networking around workers and trying to get better conditions of work, as well as environmentally and hold heavy industry, in particular extractive industries, to account. You have outfits like Via Campesina, the peasant movement, Women in Africa movement, which cuts across a whole range of extractive sectors on our continent and tries to involve particularly and empower women voices and women activists to come, because they're the most fundamentally affected and oppressed in most cases. So those are some. I mean, there are many, many more. I think we, for example, those of us in ILRIG, we've been truly inspired by some of the, even though they're not really able to have their presence on an cross-international level, but what they're attempting to do in Rojava, which in northern Syria, the Kurdistan movement, which is an eco-socialist attempt to try to build a new society based upon gender equality, on ecologically friendly policies, on basic services. It's an incredible experiment in a virtual war situation that is happening there. And it's inspired many, many collectives and cooperatives across the world to try to begin to reproduce those things, even if on a smaller scale. So there are many examples, and I'm sure I'm leaving out many, many others, but those are some that initially come to my mind.
Thanks, Dale. And then again, on a more local scale, if you could identify one or two or even three key things which you would like to see change or people have access to, if better healthcare could be one, what would they be? Three things.
Three things. Well, I think and these would be, I think, equally important, not necessarily in order of importance, but I think the one thing would be, yes, a healthcare system. Without a proper, good, public functioning healthcare system, we're not going to be able to go very far as a society on a whole range of different levels. So to me, that is an absolute fundamental need. I think at another level, it's also education. I think education and health to me are the two. And when I say health, I think that encompasses other basic services such as water and clean water and access and those things. And education, to me, without a good public education system has virtually been destroyed in this country over the last 20, 25 years to an extent. And it has massive economic and social and a whole range of other kinds of negative consequences. So it really properly resourced, well supported, good educational system that can begin to skill people to do the kinds of things that we're talking about, make new inventions, create new technologies, create new kinds of things. And then thirdly, the last one would be a new political system. And I know that that sounds like, well, that's pie in the sky, but I don't think it is. I think that all sort of the umbrella that is casting the shadow across the health, education, everything else is our political system and what we choose, our leaders and those that we choose to represent us and everything else. If they're not interested in the people, well, all those other good ideas are going to fail. They're not going to come to fruition. And we're going to be left scrambling to try to create small little versions of the same thing. What we need to do is we need to do it as a society and as globally. And without that political accountability and political, representation that really does represent the people and where the voice of the people is there, I don't think that the other ones will go very far. So to me, those three, leaving aside some others, would be fundamental to taking things forward and to changing that. And just to say at the end, when I say the political system, I mean the political and economic system at the same time. A lot of the discussion we've had today revolves around a political economic system that is based upon greed, that is based upon selfishness, that is based upon accumulation, that is based upon destruction. We need to change those fundamentals. In order to do that, we need to be educated to do it, we need to be healthy to do it, and we need to have a political system to do it.
Yeah, I think, combined with the healthcare, obviously, I read somewhere that one of those fundamental things should be very good nutrition from a very young age, because then people obviously can reach their full potentials if they are healthier and if they people are fed better food, Dale, yes, yeah, I think this was a lot of information for me and for the people that engaged with us. And I think there's still a couple of minutes. If there's anybody that on this chat that's got a question for Dale, this is your opportunity. You just want to say hi. You're welcome to do that. And whilst we're waiting, you can just pop up and say something if you want. I just also want to quickly talk about the need for a kind of a different system of agriculture, because this kind of resource, and I'm talking about plantations as well. To me, there should be diversity throughout the system of agriculture, and even to the level of reintegration of animals into the system, step back a little bit in time, more labor, more jobs being created by working with animals, better quality food, more organic kind of composts. I get so mad when industrial timber plantations are promoted as rural development in the Eastern Cape and Northern KZN. It's not development. It's disempowerment. But yeah, are there any final remarks from you, Dale?
Well, I'm going to turn my video on just right now so that I can you can see me. We just turned it off because of the bandwidth. I think was a little bit low. But just to say, I think these kinds of when Philip, when you called me up just a few days ago and said you were doing these kinds of conversations and things, and I thought to myself, what a great idea. Even if a handful of people, it makes no difference. It's not about the numbers. It's just about having conversations, sometimes having debates and disagreements and whatever, or on key issues. And I think if there's anything that I would also say, that particularly South Africa, and particularly now, besides all the big things that we talked about, that we really need to embrace, is we need to really embrace, and as progressives, as activists, as people who want to see things changing, we really need to embrace the ability to communicate with each other, to debate things, to talk about things. I think we don't talk enough about working through things. We say a lot, but I don't think I think we're talking, sometimes we talk past each other a lot. And I mean this in the broadest sense of the term. So I think we need to, one of the things that drives change, that drives the building of movements, that drives things, is constant reinforcement of ideas, testing of ideas, arguing them out, testing them, doing things. And there's a passion there, and there's a sense that we need to do that. And I think sometimes we've lost that spirit a little bit, and we've become a bit complacent about, well, yes, I've read that, that's it, that's my answer. There's no need to talk about these things. There's no need to forge a different kind of understanding. So I'm very glad to have been a part of this, and I encourage everyone to continue to do these kinds of things, because I think they're very, very important. In whatever we think, whatever different ways we come about and we come to these things, if we're not talking to each other, and we're not listening to each other, we're not learning from each other, there's no way we're going to be able to build the kind of organizations and the movements that can change things.
Exactly. I agree. And I just talking about that, Dale, did you look into thorium nuclear or not yet? Did you have an opportunity? I remember last time.
I've done a little. I haven't done as much as I've wanted to, Philip, but I'm getting there. Yeah, I've checked it out a little bit, but I'll need to do some more investigation.
No, it's just, because I'm thinking about our energy needs and the so-called sort of renewable options that we have available. You're not going to do train, fast train from Maputo to Joburg, which we should have something like that, but we're not going to drive it with solar panels. We need some form of energy that's got the capacity. And to me, it's just interesting. I don't think one should dismiss right, But and I'd like to invite you back at some stage, Dale, if it's possible for you at some stage to come back. This is the third of this series, and I really thank you for being willing to contribute. This is all going into a report which will be, identifying some issues, identifying drivers, looking at remedial actions, looking at activities and actions that is functional, and trying to get to do more of those. And I agree. Okay. Talking to each other, that's one major thing. Anybody on the group?
My pleasure, Philip. Yeah.
Great. Just one last opportunity for anybody else who wants to just chime in at this stage. Nobody's unmuting themselves. Nobody's. Okay, no, that's perfectly all right. Then I say thanks a lot, Dale. Have a nice Sunday evening. And to all of you who attended, I thank you. If you're not on the Geosphere Africa mailing list, you should be, Dale. I'm going to put your address on there, because I'll be putting, just emails out, not very regular, but say once a week or so, about who will be appearing, who we will be talking to. And what we will be talking about. So thanks a lot. Thanks to all. Have a nice Sunday evening. And we'll see you next time.
Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Thank you. Cheers.
Bye.